Hello and thanks for joining me. Not that long ago, BiblioAtlas uploaded an original tag called the second language tag, and then I also had a chance to see the medieval reader upload response to the tag, and I thought it was really interesting, because if you've seen some of my other videos that I've done, you might know that I am in the process of trying to learn a second language, and so, learning a second language is interesting to me. Language in general is interesting to me because, it's one of those fundamental human things that sort of help identify or helps us. Language is how we interpret the world, through our language largely. And so your language really sort of affects your interpretation of the world. So the different languages of the world really creates a different perspective of the world somewhat. So I find that, just fascinating. And then for the publishing industry, I was reading an article recently about, what small amount of the literature of the world actually gets translated over into English, and the challenges around translating works into English, as well as all the other languages of the world. So sharing the literature of the world among the different language speakers is a real challenge to the publishing industry. And I think it's kind of sad we don't get a lot of works in translation. We get some, but proportionally speaking, we get a really fairly small amount. So I think that's kind of sad. But anyway, the questions, this tag is really geared, part of it's geared towards people who have English as a second language, and then part of it's geared towards just learning another language in general. So I'll be focusing on just the part about learning the second language in general. So let's just jump into it. Just a few questions here. The first one is, where are you from and where do you live now? So I am from the U.S. I'm from Arkansas, so a southern state. So you may detect a southern accent in my English sometimes. I currently live on the east coast of the U.S. In the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area. So that is where I live now in the U.S., and that is where I'm from originally. Number two, what's your native language, and what other languages do you speak, read, or write? So my native language is English, as I mentioned. So the other languages I speak, read, or write. So Spanish, I'm basically an intermediate speaker and reader of Spanish. And then Portuguese is really the language that I've really been focusing my attention on becoming more fluent with over the last couple of years. I'm about an intermediate, probably reader, and an early intermediate speaker, I think, and writer. Portuguese to me is a little more challenging to pronounce than Spanish, but that might be just because of the difference in the classes that I've had, which I'll talk about next. Well, not next, but coming up. So number three, what languages do you want to learn and why? So, primarily I do want to learn Portuguese because, my partner's from Brazil, so many of our friends and family down in Brazil do not speak any English, so it would be really helpful for me to be able to be more fluent in order to communicate with them in Portuguese better. So there's that. I also just think the language itself is beautiful. It's a beautiful poetic language, both the Brazilian form and the European form. The European Portuguese, spread over a large part of the world. There are millions of speakers of Portuguese today all around the world. And so each location, each region that speaks Portuguese has a different bit of a dialect, just sort of like any language, like French or English. Languages that have spread out from their origin, they develop different accents and dialects and things. So I'm primarily learning Brazilian Portuguese, but I do have some European Portuguese thrown in there too, which I'll talk about more in a bit. So number four, how did you learn your second language and tips for others? So I learned my Spanish. I actually had 3 years in high school, so I had formal classes for Spanish, and then I wound up living in South Texas for a while, so I was around a lot of Spanish speakers, and so that gave me an opportunity to interact with Spanish speakers there often, and I had lots of friends just across the border in Mexico. I used to go visit each other, so I had a chance to really practice Spanish, and really get that sort of going. For Portuguese, I actually ended up having classes with a English teacher in Brazil. So this woman in Brazil who teaches English gave me Portuguese lessons, Brazilian Portuguese lessons via Skype. So it was a friend of a friend. That turned out to be really helpful. So she was able to give me sort of the basics of Portuguese. The grammar is very similar to Spanish, so that helped. And then I didn't mention, but I had a semester of French in college. So French is another one of these Latin-based languages, so they share sort of a grammar. And Portuguese and French share some pronunciation, I think, aspects. So having those classes in high school and in college really helped me have some of the basics of Portuguese already, although it is its own language, so of course it has its own differences. So I want to shout out though to Portuguese speakers. If you've seen some of my other videos about, I did a book haul of Portuguese language books, and I had some comments on that video in Portuguese, so that was really helpful for me to be able to read the comments in Portuguese and then need to formulate a reply in Portuguese. So I wanted to shout out to Portuguese speakers if you see this video, to give me a comment in Portuguese so that I can practice responding to you in Portuguese. So, se você fala português, por favor, deixe uma mensagem. Irá me ajudar a praticar o idioma. Okay? Obrigado. So send me a message in Portuguese. It'll help me a lot. So what I also have done is, you may remember from my book haul, I bought several books. These are the ones I've been really studying off of, mainly. Poesia Completa de Alberto Caeiro by Fernando Pessoa. This is the complete poetry of Alberto Caeiro, which is a heteronym of Fernando Pessoa, who was a European Portuguese poet of the early 20th century. And then the Libro de Desassossego. This is the Book of Disquiet by Fernando Pessoa, which I absolutely love. You can see in the Book of Disquiet, there are these little stanzas. So these are really easy to take apart and try to, work on. And then, so what I've done is and also music. The music is a really good way to practice. So how I've evolved into doing this is the lyrics for the Águas de Março, a song from Brazil. And you'll notice here, I don't know if you can tell, but there is no English on this page. Because what I've done is I've written out the lyrics to this song in Portuguese, and I don't allow myself to write any English on here. Because what I realized I was doing before was, I've been learning like this for a while, but I think I was going slower because I had the English, words, definitions, and things. And so I wasn't forced then to just deal with it in Portuguese. And so that's sort of key also for poetry. So here's a poem that I'm working on. So you'll see there's not any English in that. So what I've done is I've written out the poem in Portuguese, and I have worked out the vocabulary, and then I can practice reciting it, as well as reading it and writing it over and over, just till I get, it's sort of like memorization in a way, memorizing, how to write the words and things like that. So, but I found that by doing this, it really forms a connection. It really makes it to me. It really also brings it alive because, like for the song, of course, I know the tune, so I can actually kind of even sing along now to the Águas de Março, so that's cool. And other songs, I also have done some European songs. I love fado. So in Portugal, there's a music form called fado. That's really I think it's considered a tavern music of Lisbon, but I love fado. But fado is a little more difficult to work with than I think a lot of the Brazilian bossa nova and stuff, because bossa nova, Brazilians talk slower, a little more fluid, a little more slowly, so it's a little more easy for me to comprehend than the European fado. But nevertheless, I do like to challenge myself sometimes and dig into a fado here and there too as well. So yeah, so that's kind of what I'm doing. doing with that. Yeah, so I want to encourage anyone who is interested in a language. I do think it would help to get a grounding maybe in a class of some kind. But technology today, I don't think it's ever been easier to learn a language. If you have a teacher in that country, that's great that you can learn by Skype. You have in Booktube. There are booktubers from Brazil. There are booktubers from Portugal that I subscribe to, and I can't always follow what they're saying on their channels, but it's really kind of fun to listen in on their videos in Portuguese, in Brazilian Portuguese, and in European Portuguese. So there's that. There's YouTube videos. There's movies now, streaming, very easy to get in any language that you want, probably. So I think it's never been easier technology-wise. There's also apps. I do Memrise for vocabulary. It's an app that will give me Portuguese. It's just rote, memorizing vocabulary. There's Duolingo. There's other sites, websites, and apps to use. Really, I don't think it's ever been easier. You just have to kind of apply yourself to it. And I think it's one of those things that you just have to be really patient with yourself. And like I said, though, I think there's benefit to it. I think it's enriching even if you don't get fluent. But I can tell you, the first time I was able to actually read a poem and understand it in Portuguese was so cool. And the August de Março, like I mentioned, the song, it's kind of a familiar song. I think in at least here in the U.S., it's not unknown, but the translation when it's translated into English is not the same. So it's not the same. Actually, it's not the same word for word kind of thing. So they change it up so that it can be relatable to the U.S. Right? But if you hear the song or read the lyrics in Portuguese, it's going to be really relatable to people in Brazil, like certain kinds of trees and things that grow in Brazil. That I think they might not translate those over into English because it needs to rhyme in English too, right? So I think I'll wrap up this chat with that. I think that's about my update. I think a real good way to wrap this video up is with actually a little August de Março. Nice. Okay. Obrigado. Ciao.